Russia-Ukraine war was focused on day one at the G20 summit in Bali, but irony of ironies, even as G20 leaders are talking about how to rein in Russia, which is in the middle of a war with Ukraine since February this year, there are reports coming in of a fresh round of attacks, so powerful that half of Kyiv in Ukraine has lost power. Meanwhile, in Bali, G20 leaders mounted pressure on Russia to end the war while calling for food and energy security, both of which have been threatened because of this war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy proposed a 10-point peace plan. He joined the summit and addressed world leaders through video, but Russia dismissed it, calling it unrealistic. Now, like I said, reports have suggested a huge escalation in Kyiv. The question is, what are world leaders going to do? Importantly, Prime Minister Modi has now kicked off his G20 visit and called for diplomatic resolution to the war, while China seems to be distancing itself from Russia. India will be taking over the presidency of the G20 summit for the next 1 year and has made its agenda clear. They want unity going forward. To speak on all of these issues, and especially on the focus of G20, I'm speaking today with Leela K. Ponnappa, Maruf Raza and Vishnu Prakash, all joining us on the show. Thank you so much to all of you for speaking with us today. Ambassador Prakash, let me begin with your take on G20 and the war. Really, what else should the agenda be apart from bringing some solution to this war? It seems like all countries are instead digging in to their stated positions.
Tamanna, good evening. You spoke of an irony. Let me tell you a bigger irony, that the most intelligent of species, called human beings, are also the most foolish and are the only species which never learn from mistakes. This is a conflict that Russia cannot lose and Ukraine cannot win. Each side is talking peace but waging war. This is a continuum of the Cold War mindset, and each side is trying to gain the upper hand. Now, what is happening is that it is being played out in Ukraine, which is getting decimated. Russia is getting humbled, getting diminished, and the US and the West is pumping in armament. So that is where the situation is. Who can end the war? I'm afraid G20, India, Indonesia, other countries can urge the sides. But unless one of them is exhausted, or both of them are exhausted, or they decide that they are sleepwalking into an escalation, which can lead to something very bad, and cooler heads prevail, it will not end. And the only country that can end it today, mostly, or has perhaps a veto on that, is Washington. It is Washington's call. I think Moscow needs a face saver. Whether the face saver will be given to Moscow is $1 million question. But at the moment, I'm not optimistic that this conflict, which is supposed to be a matter of days or weeks, can end soon. The portents are not very good. It is quite ominous that the N word is being bandied about with such casualness. Tamanna.
Absolutely, it's part of the vocabulary. We're talking about this in the context of G20, and tomorrow will be a key day of sessions. India will be participating in a number of bilaterals. Ambassador Ponnappa, do you expect the kind of polarization in views vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine to also reflect at the G20 in Bali, where there will be some nations, Europe, the Western nations, who will want to outright condemn Russia? There's some who will be saying, let's not jump to conclusions. And India's position very clearly is saying, let's talk, not fight. But will this lead to any kind of solution?
I don't believe G20 is really the forum to end wars. And I think the situation is indeed rich in irony for all the reasons that Ambassador Vishnu Prakash just mentioned, but also many more. The G20 was formulated initially as a financial stabilizing kind of alternative to the Bretton Woods twins, because I think the world felt that the UN system was really not delivering. And there was a focus on finance, on trade, and things like that. Gradually, the agenda has expanded. So on the one hand, you have the formal agenda, food, security, energy, health, and such like. On the other hand, you have the focus, as you, Tamanna, very rightly said, which is the Ukraine war. If this joint declaration that is currently being drafted, and obviously the Ukraine position is one of the contentious issues, let's say there were a condemnation. Is it going to stop the war? Absolutely not. The fact is that this is Europe in turmoil. It is an upturning of the post-World War II order. It is a question of the eastward push, if you will, of NATO and of the Russian resistance. I seriously doubt that Washington alone can stop the war, because I think ultimately Russia too has to blink. It might result in a change of leadership in any one of these countries, Russia or Ukraine. But we are not into crystal ball gazing over here. The short answer to your question is, can the G20 leaders at this summit stop the war? The short answer is no.
Let me refine that question. Perhaps typically G20 is not the arena to stop wars, but look at the timing of it. Maruf, let me come to you on this. If I don't say that can G20 stop the war, should there be anything else that they should focus on? Shouldn't they work towards stopping the war? What I mean is that this is the right time. You have Russia there, you have China there, you have India there, you have a missive from Ukraine, the entire Western world. What is more important?
Yeah, Tamanna, actually your question is very pointed. And while I agree with both the distinguished ambassadors who've made some very, very important points, I have a slightly different take on some of the issues. And I'll tell you why. As you said, G20, the summit is coming at a time when the world is facing this big question: where does it all stop? Will the war come to an end? And why and how will it come to an end? Because the G20 is now a meeting ground for countries that represent the global South, which is countries like India, which is seen to be somewhat of a leader of the global South, which is developing and underdeveloped countries, while there is also the North, which is there, the rich countries, the G7. And therefore, while the G7 has their own stakes in it because they want to win the war vis-a-vis Russia, and this is what America has been pushing them towards, to belittle and destroy Russia's standing, while I personally believe that even if Russia's entire military conventional forces is destroyed, it still has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, so it's not going to be a military pushover. Superpowers don't die. They don't fade away overnight. They take time. The second thing is, when will wars end? Wars normally end when either side in conflict has been ready to negotiate, when they've got no room or no hope for victory. Pakistan in Bangladesh in 1971 was willing to negotiate a surrender because they were cornered. Or Japan was willing to surrender after World War II because American nuclear bombings had completely wreaked havoc on Japan. The same situation doesn't exist in Ukraine. So both sides, as Ambassador Vishnu Prakash brought out, Russia is not a clear winner, but Ukraine is not a loser. So therefore, it could go on. It could become, and I've been saying so from the very beginning, that it's going to be a long drawn out war of attrition. The third aspect, which I think the G20, now these are three aspects concerning Ukraine the G20 needs to look at. One is the ineffectiveness of multilateral institutions like the UN. The UN, as Ambassador Punappa rightly brought out, that's the forum where you talk about ending conflicts. But the UN has proved to be completely incompetent or ineffective to be able to impose its will because of its own terms of reference, which is, if the P5 veto a resolution, then a resolution doesn't go through. If a resolution doesn't go through, and Russia has P5, China is very much on Russia's side. So if a resolution doesn't go through, they can keep talking about it. And that's why I call the UN the world's most overrated debating society. The second thing is, what can India do at G20?
Let me come to that. Let me take a break before I come to that. Maruf, before you come with an answer, because that's my...
Please let me complete this point.
All right.
And this is where G20's interest is, because the rest of the poorer nations are having a food and energy crisis. And that food and energy crisis is a fallout of the conflict, because Ukraine was the granary of Europe, is
Absolutely.
not better part of the world,
Yeah.
that grains are not being able to export, and oil prices are going through the roof. While India can afford it, many other countries can't. So that's where the G20 has to find a middle ground and how to stall this slide further, which would obviously lead to its biggest problem, that is a recession a year or two down the line. Back to you.
All right. So, just your comment that India can afford the energy crisis, I'm not so sure. There may be a number of differing views on that. There's no question, and that it's hurt us. But you know, you've given me the perfect segue, Maruf, to the next point I was making: India's role at G20. Apart from the fact that there will be a ceremonial handover where we assume presidency for a year, what exactly will be our role and how can we shape and direct it? Ambassador Ponnappa, let me come to you on this. As with every major visit, when Prime Minister Modi goes, there is a lot of attention on, you know, the body language, him meeting and hugging world leaders, etc. But give us a clearer viewpoint of India's role right now at the G20 platform.
Well, of all the documentation that has come out so far from the summit, we have the text of the Prime Minister's statement at the working group on food and energy security. And that was interesting for 2 or 3 points that he made. Number one, he categorically called for a ceasefire and a return to diplomacy. It wasn't just a question of a return to diplomacy. He said it is time to return to the path of a ceasefire. Now, this is as clear as it can be, and it really builds on his earlier statement made in public when he engaged with Putin about this not being the era of war. So India is very clear in terms of where it stands. Secondly, he again categorically stated that on issues of the supply chains, on the crisis of essentials, he used the word havoc several times. He said the UN has been unsuccessful. Multilateral institutions like the UN have been unsuccessful. And in many ways, whether it is the G20, the East Asia Summit, the COP, these are all attempts to try to find alternatives to really the kind of sluggishness, frankly, that the UN system has got into, and in terms of denying itself the kind of reform that today's world calls for. So, and he spelled out India's objectives going forward with regard to what it would try to get G20 to focus on during its summit. He talked about the risks of uneven recovery from the pandemic. He talked about debt vulnerability, the conflict in Europe, food, energy, and inflation, the need for green development, lifestyle environment, inclusive growth, the involvement of women, the gender aspect,
Right.
and the pains of the global south. And he ended with the need for reform of global institutions. So I think you will see a lot more coming out of India on these particular aspects. And these will resonate not just in the G20, but in all other international multilateral fora that India will participate in order to give the global south the greater voice that it requires at this time. The External Affairs Minister has talked about the pains that developing countries face as a result of this war. So there will be a lot of urging with regard to the war. A mere statement of condemnation is neither here nor there. And one can say things in private, perhaps, that one does not say in public. But I think these are the areas that India will focus on as part of moving.
A packed schedule for Prime Minister Modi. All of those meetings you're seeing on your screen on November 16, by the way, is in local time in Bali, when all of those meetings will take place. I want to talk about one set of pictures, Ambassador Prakash, which a lot is being made of, is when Prime Minister Modi meets Xi Jinping and they shake hands. And it's, you know, being looked at as important considering there has been so much strife between India and China. China still continues to occupy part of our territory. Do you think that this is an important sort of moment for the two countries? Of course, no bilateral has been scheduled so far. How do you look into those pictures?
So now with China sitting on our border and the entire border live, with the kind of infrastructure that is being built, the kind of training that is being given, it is quite clear that China is in no hurry to withdraw. And given this kind of situation and the muscular approach that Emperor Xi Jinping is now projecting and talking of urging the military to win and prepare for local wars, local war means conflicts in the periphery, the task is cut out for us. Now, in this kind of situation, meeting of the two principles would not have yielded anything. It would only have, each side would have had to take a posture or play to the galleries back home. The only possible the best possible outcome was a kind of a handshake that has happened, because at the end of the day, what we say for Ukraine and Russia can be said for any country or situation, that differences cannot be sorted out through the barrel of the gun. It has to be done from on the negotiating table. India and China are destined to be partners, destined to be neighbors. We have the geography which we cannot change, so we have to find a modus vivendi. But this is the best that could have happened. I don't think that this will change things very much. I don't think that this will bring down the acrimony. But hopefully, we will continue with the talks, continue with the dialogue, and hopefully things will, there'll be more movement. That is the best outcome at the moment, because I do not see China relenting in a hurry.
All right. So, Maruf, your take, India at G20, the role that we can play, and this vis-a-vis our stance on Ukraine and Russia. Ambassador Ponappa talked about a very key portion of the readout where we speak of a ceasefire. Do you think there is a hardening of position, or is India's position still very, very clear? We're not going to take sides.
There's been speculation before Mr. Jaishankar went to Moscow that India was going to become the negotiator on the Ukraine conflict, and there was no mention of it after his visit finished to Moscow. And so there's a lot of this kind of talk which comes out, not just in Indian media, but even Western media, because of the reason that India seems to be one of the countries that enjoys the confidence of Moscow and Washington. But I think there is a history. India has an allergy to mediation, and India has from time to time made a statement that this is a conflict in Europe and the Europeans have to sort it out. We can only urge peace and dialogue, which is our traditional Gandhian stand. Now, the fact of the matter is that we cannot jump into it with a flag in our hand and say, follow me, because the rest of the countries are waiting and watching who's going to be the first one to be invited to take the call. And more importantly, does America want a ceasefire? Does Russia want a ceasefire? My research has shown that America is making a decent amount of money out of selling arms. America has also found a leadership role in Europe when it was booted out of Afghanistan. And Mr. Biden has now found his calling card as he's become the leader-in-chief of Europe and NATO, which is what the role America had before Trump went and spoiled the party. Now, as far as Putin is concerned, Putin is not in a mood to give in, because having started the conflict, he has to go back to his people with some serious deliverables. And the interesting thing is, despite the annexation talk, two of the regions, Zaporozhye and the one near Mariupol, those regions, the Russians have said that the boundaries are not very clearly defined. If the world is willing to accept that the Russians are there to stay in that part of Ukraine, like they were willing to accept Crimea, despite the utterances here and there, then we could see the easing off of tension. These attacks on Kyiv that's happened today, I think they are a distraction. In military terms, we call them a feint, so that there is panic when Zelenskyy is showing the victory sign. There's suddenly bombing and half of Kyiv goes lights out. So there are lots of issues there. And there is money to be made both by Russia and America with this ongoing conflict.
Well, what about the impoverishment of many, many countries in the world? The poor are getting poorer.
That's the important, Tamanna, that's the most important thing, that sadly, history has shown us big powers pay lip service to the requirements of the poor man on the street, but big powers will do what their big agendas tell them to do.
Well,
So
I hope
this is one of the ironies of
Absolutely.
geopolitics. The two distinguished ambassadors might correct me on that,
Right.
but that is the real challenge, to find that one element that will twist the whole story around to the table. And
Well,
eventually, I always argue,
G20 is definitely an opportunity with some of the most powerful people and some of the most powerful leaders in the room. Are they going to do something about it or not remains the key question. I'm going to wrap it here, but I want to thank all of you for joining us on the show today as I move on to the next